I bought the farm 6 months after Levi passed, when the house suddenly felt too small for my grief and too big for my breathing. The inheritance he left me was the last thing he ever put in my hands, and I spent it the only way that made sense. On land, on open sky, on something that wouldn't remind me every hour that he wasn't there to fill the silence. 42 acres, all sloping and uneven, with trees that shed bark like old secrets, and a guest house that looked tired enough to sleep for a decade. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It needed to be mine. I settled in slowly, one drawer at a time, one curtain at a time, letting the place get used to me. The days were quiet in a way the city never allowed. I learned the sound of the wind through each row of fence posts. I learned how the air changed just before the first evening chill. I learned what it felt like to wake up without anyone else's needs shaping the morning. Then Carson texted, "Coming this weekend, bringing Renee's family. Just make space. No greeting. No how are you. Just instructions." I stared at the screen long enough for the letters to blur. He rarely visited without an agenda, but I tried to believe this time might be different. Maybe they simply wanted to see where I lived now. Maybe they were curious. Maybe they just missed me. When they arrived, 2 SUVs rolled up the gravel drive like they were delivering a moving crew. I stepped out onto the porch, smoothing my shirt without meaning to, but Carson didn't even climb the steps. He nodded at me barely, then pointed toward the garage. "Stay in there for the weekend," he said. "We'll take care of the rest." He spoke like someone assigning chores, not relocating his mother. I felt the words land before I understood them. The garage, as if I were something that could be stored. I didn't argue. I just stepped aside, watching as doors opened, and people I'd never met started unloading their weekend onto my land, already acting like they belonged. And as I walked toward the garage with a blanket under my arm, the first hints of something uneasy stirred in my chest, following me into the dim light of that narrow room. As the weekend began, the guest house used to smell like old pine and paper, part storage, part memory. I had tucked away some of Levi's flannel shirts, a small stack of books we'd collected over the years, a wooden toolbox he insisted on keeping even when the handle cracked. It wasn't a showpiece, just a room with 4 honest walls. I'd never thought of it as much more than a place for keeping things I didn't have the heart to throw out. When I opened the door that morning, everything was gone. Shelves bare, carpet vacuumed, curtains replaced with cheap gray panels. Even the photos, those small framed prints of the Grand Canyon we'd picked up in '98, had been taken down. There was nothing left to suggest anyone had ever lived here or loved here. Carson came around the corner carrying a cooler in one hand. "Oh good. You found it," he said. "Where did everything go?" I asked. "I cleared it out yesterday. Renee's parents need real rooms." Like that explained everything. Like it wasn't mine to begin with. They brought in crates of wine and 3 ring lights for what I still don't know. An air purifier hummed on the floor before it was even plugged in. Someone laid a tablecloth over the guest house bed and called it charming. Renee's father took pictures of the view from the side window. I stood to the side, trying to stay out of their photos. Out of the way. Later, I heard one of Renee's cousins ask, "So where's your mom staying?" Carson, holding a glass of lemonade, gave the most effortless shrug. "Somewhere around here." Like I was a misplaced garden tool. That night, I laid out the blanket in the garage and watched moths batter themselves against the bulb above the workbench. I hadn't said anything yet. Not when the guest house was taken. Not when my things were removed. Not even when I heard them laughing from my own porch like it was theirs. I knew what silence could buy me. I just didn't know yet what it would cost. And in the middle of the night, their voices came through the wall. During the day, the house barely remembered me. They filled it with smells I didn't recognize. Imported oils, something smoked and strong, and the sound of Renee's voice telling everyone which plates to use, which ones looked too tired. My dishes were boxed up by noon. Someone labeled a bin declutter and tucked it under the stairs. Renee's brother walked around with his phone held flat like a scanner, measuring steps, corners, door frames. "Just curious," he said. When I asked, "This layout's got real potential." No one ever asked if I wanted potential or if I'd had any plans for the place at all. By evening, the porch lights were turned on bright and their music drifted across the field like it belonged to the wind. I stayed in the garage with my tea, and the dogs next door barking into the dark. I told myself it would pass, that this was just a bad weekend, that they would leave as quickly as they came. But then came the voices. Thin walls carry secrets even when no one wants to hear them. She's slowing down. Carson's voice hushed but clear. She mixes up the mail sometimes, said Renee. Pause, then Carson again. Once we get her declared incompetent, it's ours. The whole place. No contest. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. It wasn't surprise that hit me. It was the understanding that they'd been rehearsing this. This wasn't new. It had been building in the quiet beneath every visit where he'd asked if I was still keeping up, beneath the sideways comments about my memory, my handwriting, the bills I still insisted on paying by check. They weren't planning a visit. They were planning a transition from my life to theirs. I sat there on the edge of the cot until morning, my hands flat on my knees, heart steady in a way that scared me. And before the sun rose, I opened the filing box I kept in the garage and pulled out the folder Levi left behind. I had opened the folder only once before, on the night Levi died, when grief made my hands shake too badly to hold anything steady. The paper smelled like the drawer he kept it in, dry, old, faintly metallic. I remembered sliding it back into the box because I couldn't imagine a world where I would ever need something prepared for a moment this dark. But now, sitting on the edge of a cot in the garage while my son planned to erase me room by room, I opened it again. Levi's handwriting covered the first page, uneven from the months he'd spent in treatment. He'd written, "Use this only if they stop treating you like a person." I traced the words with my thumb and felt the quiet warning he'd tried to leave behind. Not a prophecy, not bitterness, just a man who'd seen more of human nature than I wanted to admit. Inside was the LLC he created years ago when he thought we might invest in rental cabins someday. Horizon Plain LLC, still active, still in his name and mine. I'd used that LLC to buy the farm because it felt like honoring his last bit of planning. Simpler taxes, the realtor had said, but Levi had meant it as a shield. Beneath that was the clause, a legal paragraph he'd copied from an elder attorney's sample document. It protected property owners from coercion, manipulation, forced relocation. He had written a note beside it. If something ever feels wrong, add this to whatever you buy. So I had quietly, without telling Carson or anyone else. I'd handed the page to the notary the day I closed on the farm, and she'd nodded like she'd seen 100 such precautions. I held the folder on my lap and breathed slowly, letting the hum of distant voices fade. They thought I was unprepared. They thought I'd hand over my life the moment they pressed hard enough. What they didn't know was that Levi had left me more than money. He'd left a map. I slipped the folder back into the box and closed the lid just as footsteps crossed the gravel outside the garage. They came just after noon. A line of unfamiliar sedans pulled up like they had appointments. Crisp shirts, heels too sharp for gravel. One of them stepped out holding a leather-bound folder, the kind used to sell other people's futures. I stayed where I was, behind the henhouse, out of sight, with grain still clinging to my palms. I knew the moment I saw them this wasn't accidental. They weren't here for wine or family photos. This is a real opportunity, one of them said as she pointed toward the slope behind the main house. The land practically sells itself. Carson nodded like he'd been here forever. We've got plans, he said. A retreat center, maybe yoga. We're looking into next steps. He spoke with ease, his voice carrying across the field. Like I'd already agreed, like I didn't exist. I pulled out my phone and started quietly collecting what they seemed so eager to stage. Faces. Car plates. The woman in the beige blazer who stepped through my garden path without glancing down. The man who asked if the barn had plumbing. They didn't ask where I was. Or maybe they didn't care. No one noticed the second-floor window cracked open. No one looked for me at all. When they left, after laughter, handshakes, promises of follow-ups, I walked through the house and felt how the air had changed. It wasn't just invasion. It was assumption, the kind that comes when people believe the door already belongs to them. That evening, I installed a second camera under the eave facing the guest house. Nothing dramatic, just insurance. Later, I walked the edge of the property, letting my boots sink into the soft, packed earth Levi and I once dreamed about planting. I stopped at the old bench beneath the oak and sat in the quiet. They were drawing lines in pencil. I had mine in ink. The next morning, Carson knocked on the kitchen door holding 2 mugs and something folded in his hand. Carson came in without knocking, as if he still believed the threshold belonged to him. He carried 2 mugs but only set one on the counter. His other hand held a folded piece of paper. "You're making everyone uncomfortable," he said. I didn't look up from the sink. "You mean I'm still here?" He let out that tired sigh he'd used since he was a teenager. "Caught lying about curfew. We're trying to help, Mom. This place is too much for you. You can still live here, just less visibly." I dried my hands slowly and turned toward the bread box. It had sat in that same corner since the day I moved in. Carson probably thought it held stale crackers or old coupons, but Levi always said the best safes don't need locks, just places people never look. I reached under the box and pulled out the thick manila envelope. "Here," I said, placing it between us. He opened it lazily at first, like it was going to be sentimental photos or some letter he'd pretend to read. But then his fingers stiffened. Inside were the documents Levi and I had set aside years ago: the active registration for Horizon Plane LLC, the deed with the LLC listed as full owner, and a notarized trust clause affirming I was its sole manager and protected resident. "You never asked who owns this land?" I said, my voice even. He didn't speak right away. He just stared at the top page like it had betrayed him. "You used the LLC," he muttered. I nodded. "And the deed's under it?" "Yes, it has been since the beginning." He set the papers down more carefully than he'd picked them up, but his jaw was tight, eyes flicking toward the hallway like he needed to tell someone or warn them. "I think it's time you all started packing," I said. "You've had your visit." He opened his mouth like he might argue, then closed it again. And for the first time all week, Carson left without another word. By nightfall, the house was quiet again, except for the sound of tape being pulled from cardboard boxes. By Tuesday morning, the house had thinned out. Drawers were left half open, cabinet doors ajar, as if the space itself had exhaled. The guest house lights stayed off. Someone had taken down the ring lights and left them by the kitchen door without a box, cords tangled like nerves. Renee passed me in the hallway without a word. She looked down and away, clutching a scarf that wasn't hers. Her father knocked on the back door before stepping in, holding one of my old mixing bowls in both hands. "I think this is yours," he said, setting it down gently. The rim was chipped. I didn't respond. There was no reason to. No one said goodbye. By mid-afternoon, their SUVs rolled back onto the gravel, loaded with folded patio chairs, reusable shopping bags, and the rest of the weekend they had tried to make permanent. I watched from the side window, not hiding, just still. When Carson opened the driver's side door, he hesitated, then turned back. He left a folded note on the kitchen counter. "Didn't mean to upset you." I read it once, then slipped it into the compost bin with the eggshells and wilted spinach. That night, I walked the property line with a flashlight in one hand and my palm grazing the fence as I went. The metal was cool and steady. The field was quiet now. No music, no voices, just the steady hum of things returning to stillness. They hadn't just taken space in the house. They had carved into the shape of who I was supposed to be, reduced me to an obstacle, a detour, something in the way of what they wanted. At the edge of the northern field, I stopped and looked out across the pasture where Levi once stood with a notepad, sketching where he'd imagined an orchard might go. Maybe I'd plant it after all. The next morning, I brewed my coffee, stepped onto the porch, and saw a delivery van pulling up the drive with someone else in the passenger seat. They insisted on having one last dinner before leaving, though no one seemed to know why. The table was set neatly enough, but without the warmth that usually fills a room when people plan to break bread together. No candles, no soft music, just the scrape of plates and the low hum of people trying not to speak too loudly. Carson sat across from me, shoulders drawn tight, staring at his plate as if the pattern might reveal an escape route. He kept pushing food around with his fork, but hardly ate. Renee, trying to fill the silence, stood and retrieved a bottle from the counter. It was one Levi had saved for his last birthday, an old red he'd insisted we keep for a good moment. Renee held it out with a hopeful smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We thought it might be nice to share this," she said. I took the bottle, turned it slowly in my hands, and nodded. "Thank you," I said. But I didn't open it. She sat down again, smoothing her dress in a motion that seemed more like an apology than a gesture of comfort. Her father cleared his throat twice, as if trying to think of something neutral to say, but nothing came. The rest of the dinner slipped by in short sentences and clattering cutlery. When it ended, chairs were pushed in too quickly, and goodbyes were replaced with small nods and forced smiles. They filed out the door without lingering. One by one, engines started, headlights swept across the field, and tires crunched over the gravel. Carson lingered a moment longer, hesitating near the bottom step. But whatever words he considered never found their way out. Then he left too. When the last beam of light disappeared down the drive, the porch fell into a stillness that felt like the first real thing I'd been given all weekend. I sat there with the unopened bottle beside me, letting the night settle, letting the quiet spread until it reached the corners they'd tried to fill. I stayed outside until the sky shifted from black to blue, until the stars dimmed, and until the morning finally rose over the fence line, just as another idea started forming at the back of my mind. The morning after they left, I walked the length of the drive with a tape measure in my pocket and gravel crunching under my boots. The air felt different, lighter, like the land had exhaled after holding itself tense for too long. At the bottom of the road, I stopped where the old wooden posts leaned inward and tapped the metal with my knuckle. It was time. I called a welder I'd met at the feed store months earlier. He showed up 2 days later in a dusty truck, took one look at the slope of the road and nodded. "You want something strong?" he said. "Not pretty." "Strong is enough," I told him. By late afternoon, a new steel gate stood at the base of the drive. No ornaments, no flourishes, just a clean line of metal marking the beginning of my land. I didn't add a lock that day. The gate wasn't meant to keep anyone out. It was meant to remind me where the boundary truly was. Inside, the house still carried echoes of the weekend. A misplaced dish towel, a chair pushed slightly off angle. I walked through each room, setting things back where they belonged. It wasn't anger guiding my hands, just the quiet insistence that the place knew who it lived with. The next morning, I drove into town and filed a simple report with the county clerk. Not a complaint, not an accusation, just documentation. Names, dates, who entered the property, and why I was clarifying ownership. The clerk stamped it with little ceremony, sliding the page into a drawer that likely held hundreds just like it. Still, it felt like a small stone placed exactly where it needed to be. Back home, I opened all the windows in the guest house, letting fresh air sweep through the rooms Carson had emptied. I repainted the walls a warm, muted tone and scrubbed the scuffs from the floorboards. When it dried, I took a few photos and listed the space online as a short-term rental for artists. A new tenant booked within hours. By sundown, the property felt like mine again, quiet, steady, breathing at its own pace. And the next morning, as I stepped onto the porch with my coffee, I saw another envelope sitting on the top step waiting for me. Spring came without asking. The trees on the ridge softened into green again, and the hens laid more eggs than I could use. I painted a sign on an old board. "Take what you need," and left a few cartons by the mailbox in a small cooler. Sometimes people left $1 or $2. Sometimes they left nothing. That wasn't the point. The house settled back into its rhythm. I moved slower, not because I had to, but because I could. The land didn't rush me. It never had. Then one morning, there was an envelope tucked under the flower pot by the porch. No stamp. Just my name on the front written in Carson's careful block letters. I stood there for a long moment before opening it. "We thought we were helping," he wrote. "If you ever reconsider, just call." That was all. No apology, no ownership, just the echo of something that once sounded like concern, repackaged into distance. I folded the letter and returned it to its envelope, then slid it into the drawer beneath the phone. I didn't tear it up. I didn't frame it in my mind. I just put it away where it couldn't take up space. Later that afternoon, I called a women's shelter 20 miles south. I'd been thinking about it for a while, how empty the guest house still felt between visits, how quiet. I asked if they ever needed short-term housing, a place for someone in transition. They did. Within a week, I had named scheduled preferences. A woman named Jolene moved in first. She arrived with just a backpack and a careful voice. I gave her the key, pointed out the light switches, then left her to settle in. The house breathed with someone new again. That evening, I boiled water for tea and sat on the porch as the sun faded, the wind brushing over the slope. Levi once thought might grow apples. The kettle let out a low whistle from inside, and I let it go a few seconds longer than usual before rising to answer.